Imagine living in a country where housing is available only through the state, and people must often wait years to be allocated a flat. At the same time, buildings in the town centres are disused and left to decay. How did this situation arise? Let's take a look behind the scenes.
No one has any intention of building a wall.
Neither ox nor donkey can stop the progress of socialism.
I love everyone, all people.
We are the people.
After the Second World War, Germany lay in ruins. Millions of people were in desperate need of somewhere to live. Housing shortages were widespread, particularly in the GDR.
Many cities suffered extensive bomb damage. People often lived in ruins, sometimes in wooden barracks. And of course, East Germany, and also West Germany to a degree, experienced an influx of refugees and displaced persons from the former Eastern territories.
In 1952, the GDR embarked on a prestigious new building program, the Stalinallee in East Berlin. Intended to showcase a new standard of living, it soon became clear that it could not address the problem of housing shortages.
At that time, most people still lived in barracks or ruins. The new national building tradition, however, was elaborate and expensive. But it wasn't until a shift in priorities in the late 50s and early 60s that this model was abandoned.
The solution came after the transfer of power in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin to Nikita Khrushchev.
Build faster, build better, build cheaper. Those were his three guiding principles for a new era of industrial production. Throughout the socialist world, the mass production of prefabricated housing elements was put into practice. The state answered the need for housing construction with a program of mass housing construction.
The first experimental concrete slab housing block was built in Berlin, Johannisthal as early as 1953. From the 1960s and into the 1970s, entire cities and neighborhoods were then built using prefabricated concrete slab elements in Halle, Neustadt, Eisenhüttenstadt, and Hoyerswerda as part of the state housing construction program.
Moving here from an old, run-down building or barracks was certainly a step up in the world for most families. Now they had their own flat, with district heating and running water. That was by no means normal at that time. In fact, it was really rather special. The new housing estates were also conceived according to a new model of socialist society. These so-called housing complexes also incorporated social infrastructure in the form of kindergartens, schools, hospitals, and shops. The place of work was elsewhere, which is why they're often called dormitory estates. The residents went to work in the morning, returning again in the afternoon. But other than that, they were able to live safely in their own little cosmos.
4 schools, 4 kindergartens and nurseries, a retirement home and the first supermarket have already been completed. By the end of the year, the S-Bahn and trams will run to Berlin, Hohenschönhausen, and the first restaurant and services should be open for business. The Berlin Housing Collective's main priority, however, is to have the flats ready for use on time. An impressive pace of construction that has already improved the living conditions of some 9,000 residents this year alone.
Prefabricated slab housing blocks would become emblematic of socialist housing. They were cheap to produce and standardized to meet the needs of different residents. A family with 2 children, for example, was usually allocated a 3-room flat of 60 to 65 square meters. One was not free to choose a flat of a particular size.
In that respect, there were no differences. A university professor had no right to a better apartment. In fact, that wasn't even possible, as all the flats were identical. There were, of course, a range of sizes, from 1-room to 4-room apartments. But in these new developments, it was in effect a classless society.
In 1984, the GDR leadership completed the 2 millionth dwelling. Erich Honecker, the head of state and party leader, used the occasion to visit in person and celebrate the success of the GDR housing program. To each his own apartment was the slogan of the SED's ambitious goal.
This is quite spacious. Are these the children's rooms?
But there were also downsides. The apartments often had technical defects, and the residents and visitors were logged in a so-called house book. Rents were low, no more than 1.25 marks per square meter, but this also meant that funds were lacking to maintain the housing stock. It cost far more to build and maintain the housing than the rental income could cover. Materials were also in short supply, and repairs could often take months. The situation was made worse by the fact that in prioritizing the provision of socialist housing, the SED allowed old buildings to fall into a state of disrepair.
A big problem, of course, was that mass housing estates were built on the outskirts of the cities, while the old town centres were neglected. They literally crumbled and fell into disrepair. It wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s that planners and politicians in the GDR began to appreciate the cultural, historical and architectural value of the old town centres. A smaller scale variant of the slab block construction was then developed for use in such contexts, for what they called replacement structures.
Despite the massive scale of housing construction, the shortage of housing was an ongoing problem. Those on the waiting list needed special connections or a lot of patience. In the 1980s, some young people, especially those critical of the system, began to occupy rundown buildings in the city centres.
Sometimes, the previous occupant helped maintain the semi-legal status quo. When they moved out, they left the keys on the table for the next occupant. Those who were especially willing would leave a note with the account number and rent price, so the next person could simply continue paying.
Den Schlüssel gefunden hat, beziehungsweise dann die Kontonummer und den Mietpreis und einfach weiter eingezahlt hat.
By the time the authorities noticed a change of tenant, and the GDR administration was exceptionally slow, 3 years of rent may have been paid. This form of clandestine squatting could therefore be very fortuitous.
These dilapidated buildings provided space for individual groups to pursue alternative lifestyles and creative expressions with comparative freedom, outside of constant state surveillance. In West Germany, many were able to realize their dream of owning a home. That was all but impossible in the GDR. Private home ownership was rare and building materials were scarce. Today, most towns and cities in former East Germany have been renovated and redeveloped, and it is hard to imagine their state of disrepair in 1989 when the GDR came to an end.